Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Tuesday? Yom Shlishi. John in Maine. Bella in Florida. Peg in Colorado. Sharon in Las Vegas. Welcome to the Western U.S. Shandora in the Bronx. Marjorie in Georgia. Elisa Shalom. Lynn in North Texas. Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Joe in the Inland Empire. Last minute entry before I get into it. We have a relatively short but interesting daf, page 21. Yeah, page 21 here in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. We are finishing today our discussion of Mishna number 3, which basically here in chapter 2, which basically says that you can write the get, the bill of divorce, with almost any kind of ink or substance on almost any kind of surface, with some exceptions. We picked this up near the top of page 21a, where Rava says, if he, the husband, wrote her a get, the bill of divorce, and placed it in the hand of his slave, and he wrote her a deed of gift with regard to the slave, and then she acquired the slave due to the document, and she is then she is divorced immediately by the bill of divorce that is in his hand, right? The operative thing here, right? We've been talking about the elements of the get. We haven't really talked specifically about what has to be written in the get, but it's basically the husband saying, I hereby divorce you, and he has to sign that. And as we know, the get has to be written particularly for her. No off-the-shelf template get, as it were. It has to be written for that situation. He has to sign it in front of witnesses, and it has to be handed to her in front of witnesses. And what is it that's being handed to her in front of witnesses? Well, normally you would think it's some kind of a scroll, a parchment, a piece of paper that has the information of the get written on it. But here in this Mishnah, we've been discussing that there's all kinds of things that you could actually write the get on. Who would ever do that? Why would they ever do it? That's not really the point. So many of these questions are quite hypothetical in nature, just to establish what the limits of the law are. Yesterday we discussed that the husband could write the get on a plate made out of gold, right? And not only would that qualify as a valid get, but if the husband specified that this plate of gold also constitutes the ketubah payment, right, the payment that he owes her under the marriage contract now that he's divorcing her, then the gold could be used to satisfy the portion of the marriage payment obligation, marriage contract obligation, that according to the value of the plate, right? If he owes more than the value of the plate, he still owes the remainder. Now, who would ever write a get on the hand of a slave? I doubt that ever happened. But again, they're testing the limits of the law. And the reason that the case of the slave is legally interesting, no matter how distasteful to the modern ear the idea of slavery is, as it was practiced in the ancient world, really what's at issue here, what makes it interesting to the sages, is that the slave is an agent with an independent will, right? I mean, the slave is owned, he is technically property, and the husband would have to give the slave to the wife in the same way that he would give her a document that had the information of the get written on it, right? So if he's sending the get written on the hand of the slave, he has to give her the slave in order for her to receive the get. And presumably, like the plate of gold, if he specified that the value of the slave on which the get is written is being used to satisfy the ketubah payment, then it would be credited toward his obligation under the marriage contract. But if he didn't specify that, then the slave would constitute, so to speak, a very expensive document that he would give to her, but she wouldn't, he wouldn't get credit for having satisfied all or part of his marriage contract obligation. Okay, so we continue here. Now we're talking about something a little bit different, right? When does giving actually happen? Right? So if he places it literally in her hand, if he takes a document and places it in her hand, okay, now you're divorced. Okay, we get it. Obviously, he gave her the document. But as we'll see today, the act of giving doesn't necessarily mean placing a document in her hand. If he did something bizarre, like write the get on the hand of a slave, what does it mean that he gives her the slave? There has to be some kind of formal acquisition by her of the slave. It's not going to be receiving it in her hand. Maybe it's pulling the slave to her. Maybe it's something else, right? So Rava says if he wrote a bill of divorce, now it's not written on the hand of the slave. This is different. If he wrote her a bill of divorce and he placed it in the hand, right? So there is an actual document, a paper, but he placed that in the hand of the slave. So the slave now is a kind of agent of delivery, and he's holding the document. And he wrote her a deed of gift with regard to the slave. Okay, so that's how the giving is occurring here. But it's not because the slave is the actual, document, so to speak, because the get was written on his hand. Rather, the slave is holding the get. But he then makes a deed of gift of the slave in the same way he would make a deed of gift to give her a piece of land. And the law of slaves is often similar to the law of real property and other areas of the law. So what they're saying here is that he gives her the slave. The get itself is in the hand of the slave. When the slave becomes hers, when it passes from the husband's property, when the slave passes from being the husband's property to being the wife's property, and now he's holding the get in his hand, then the slave's hand is like her hand, and the slave has received the get on her behalf. And that's why at the moment that she accepts the gift of the slave, she also becomes divorced from the husband because the slave is holding the get in his hand. That's what Rava is teaching. The slave is considered to be like her property because of the deed of gift, and it is as though the husband had placed the bill of divorce in her domain at the time that he transferred the slave to her, and she acquires the bill of divorce as though it were placed into her courtyard, because this is another way that you can deliver the get to the wife. Maybe she doesn't want to accept it from you. Maybe she doesn't want to accept that they're divorced, and she won't take it into her hand. But if she has real property, real estate, like a courtyard that is her property, and the husband places the get in her domain, in her property, then that satisfies the requirement that he give her the get, and they would be divorced at that time. Now, the Gemara asks, and why does she acquire the bill of divorce? The slave is considered a mobile courtyard, mobile. And a mobile courtyard does not acquire property. So if you're saying, okay, we have a law that the husband can take the get and place it in her domain, in her courtyard, and that would constitute giving it to her. And in certain areas of Jewish law, halakhic law, slavery, as it was practiced in the ancient world, a slave is equivalent to a piece of real property. So if he can place it in the courtyard, why can't he place it in the hand of her slave? That's her property, and it doesn't count. And the answer is because courtyards don't move. We know it's her domain. The husband can count on it being her domain, and he places it in her domain. She received it. But a slave, even if it is her property, a slave moves around, has independent agency, has a mind of his own. And that makes him different than real property. So while it may be that in some areas of Torah law, slaves are like real property, in other ways, they're not, right? It's not an absolute comparison. So one's courtyard can acquire items for him only when the courtyard is fixed in its location. Since a slave is considered to be like land with regard to other areas of halacha, of Jewish law, He should also be defined as a mobile courtyard, as he can move from place to place. And if you would say that Rava was referring to a slave who happens to be standing and who is not mobile, but didn't Rava say anything that does not acquire when moving also does not acquire when it is sitting or standing? And the fact that the slave could move gives him the status of a moving courtyard, regardless of whether he is currently moving or not. And the Gemara answers, and the halacha taught by Rava could apply in a case where the slave was bound and unable to move, as in that case, he is not even able to move at all, and then he would not be considered to be a mobile courtyard. Where did the law end up on this, right? Where does the halacha? If the husband wrote his bill of divorce and gave it to his slave, and wrote her a deed of gift with regard to the slave, then once she takes possession of the slave, she automatically takes possession of the bill of divorce, and she is divorced through it. And this applies specifically when the slave is bound at the time, in accordance with the Gemara's conclusion with regard to Rava's statement. And the Gra, right, the Vilna Gaon, notes that according to most of the early commentaries, Rashi, Tosafos, Rosh, Rashba, Ran, the woman is not divorced unless the slave is sleeping and bound, right? So it's a very limited set of circumstances where the husband could, place the get in the hand of the slave, and the slave acquires for the wife, merely because the slave would be her property. Very limited circumstances. Now, Rava also says if he wrote her a bill of divorce and placed it in his courtyard, and then he wrote a deed of gift with regard to the courtyard, well, then she has acquired the courtyard and is divorced immediately by the bill of divorce in the courtyard. That follows from what we just said, because the courtyard can't be moving around. It's not an independent agent with free will, which a slave has, even though obviously he does not have complete free will because he's a slave. Now, the Gemara comments, and it is necessary for Rava to teach his halacha both with regard to a slave and with regard to a courtyard. One could not have been learned from the other, as, had he taught us only about a slave, I would say that the husband may transfer the bill of divorce to his wife, specifically through a slave, but in the case of a courtyard, the sages may decide to enact a decree that this should not be a valid bill of divorce due to the case of her courtyard that comes afterward. Meaning, people may not differentiate between this case and a similar case where the husband places the bill of divorce in the courtyard of a third party, and that courtyard is subsequently acquired by her. In that case, the couple is not divorced, as the bill of divorce was not given by the husband to the wife, right? He placed the bill of divorce in a courtyard. He sold that courtyard to someone else. That person sold the courtyard to the wife. The husband never gave it to the wife. Whereas if he placed the bill of divorce in his courtyard and then he gave that courtyard to his wife, he gave her the bill of divorce along with the courtyard. And that's why she would be divorced in that case. Lest we be confused between these two cases, the sages might say, okay, you can't place a bill of divorce into a woman's courtyard and she is divorced thereby, but the sages did not enact such a decree. And had Rava taught us only about the courtyard, then I would say that a woman is divorced specifically if her husband placed the bill of divorce in a courtyard. But in the case of a slave, the sages may decide to decree with regard to a bound slave that the divorce will not take effect due to the similarity to an unbound slave where the divorce would not take effect, as explained above. Therefore, Rava teaches us that it is a valid bill of divorce in both cases. But again, he could only place the bill of divorce in the slave's hand if the slave was bound and could absolutely not move. Why would a husband do such a thing? I'm sure no husband ever did such a thing. But what would be the law if he did, right? That's the question being asked. Now, Abaye said as a challenge to Rava, now, from where was a courtyard included? What is the source for the law that a man can divorce a woman by placing a bill of divorce in her courtyard? The Torah says in Deuteronomy 24:1, and he gives it in her hand. Sounds like he has to hand the get to her hand. How is giving it to her courtyard the equivalent of placing it in her hand? Well, the sages derived that this phrase in her hand is not limited to her actual hand, but also includes anything that is an extension of her hand, and that would include her courtyard. Consequently, the following reasoning should apply. Just as with regard to her hand, that it acquires property for her, whether with her consent or against her will, so too with regard to her courtyard, it should be that it acquires property for her, whether with her consent or against her will. And with regard to a gift, it is so that she acquires it with her consent, but it is not so that she acquires it against her will. A person does not need to accept a gift. Just because I own a courtyard and somebody dumped their old golf clubs in my courtyard doesn't mean that I must accept the gift of those golf clubs. If I say, get your golf clubs out of here, I don't want your golf clubs. Don't leave them here. I do not accept your gift. Whether you placed it in my hand or you placed it in my courtyard, I do not have to take a gift against my will. And so likewise, you might say, does she have to receive a get against her will? Maybe she doesn't want to receive the get. Why? Maybe she won't take it into her hand. Why then does she have to take it into her courtyard is what they're asking, right? With regard to a gift, it is so that she acquires it with her consent. A person can acquire a gift with their consent, but it is not so that a person acquires a gift against his will or her will. Therefore, a courtyard that a husband transfers to his wife as a gift along with the bill of divorce that is in it is not the same as a bill of divorce that he gives into her hand, as a courtyard is different from her hand in this sense. So it should not be able to be used as a means of transferring a bill of divorce, argues the Gemara. Now, Rav Shimi Bar Ashi objects to the reasoning presented by Abaye. But what of agency for receipt of the bill of divorce, where the woman appoints an agent to receive a bill of divorce on her behalf, concerning which the agent can act with her consent, but not against her will. No one other than the wife can appoint an agent to receive the bill of divorce. And despite this, he is an agent for receipt. Yet a woman is able to appoint an agent for receipt. Evidently, the comparison of other methods of acquisition to acquisition by placing the bill of divorce in her hand is not absolute. And Abaye would respond, is that to say that the law of agency is included from the words her hand? It is not learned from there. Rather, it is included based on the additional wording of the verse. It's not because it says in her hand, but rather the rest of the verse, as it states, and sends her out, right? That the husband, when he divorces her, he sends her out. So the expanded term teaches that a woman can also appoint an agent to receive a bill of divorce on her behalf. She can do that. Since agency has a different source in the Torah, it is not impacted by the limitations of her hand. The law that a bill of divorce can be given to her by placing it in her courtyard is an extension of the law that it can be placed in her hand and does carry the limitations of her hand. Therefore, it must be able to work whether with her consent or against her will. Let's read some of these laws where this argument ended up. First of all, in terms of just placing it in a courtyard. So if the husband placed the bill of divorce in his own courtyard, and then he sold his wife the courtyard, or he gave her the courtyard as a gift, then once she has acquired the courtyard through one of the modes of acquisition of land, she is divorced in accordance with Rava's statement. Okay, that's in terms of he put it in his own courtyard and then he gifted her the courtyard and she accepted the gift of the courtyard. If one received a gift, took possession of it, and afterward decided that he did not want it, it is of no consequence. Once you accept the gift, you can't change your mind. It became yours. However, if from the outset the recipient said that he did not want the gift, then he does not acquire it, and it does return to the previous owner. Are we going to settle here on this page whether the husband can place the bill of divorce in her courtyard that she already owns? I don't think we're solving that yet. It's an ongoing discussion, but for sure my recollection is yes, you can place the bill of divorce in her courtyard and then she is divorced. But let's continue the discussion here. Okay, and if you wish, say a different answer. We also have found that agency for receipt can be effective against her will. How so? As the law is that a father can receive a bill of divorce for his minor daughter against her will, and the laws of agency are therefore consistent with the laws with regard to her hand, and Abaye's objection stands. Okay, but that's not a good example because, in other words, if a man betrothed a girl who's a minor, they're not married yet, but they've made an agreement to get married. Who made the agreement? This man, the prospective groom, and the girl's father, because she's a minor. If then, before they actually get married, the man decides to end the betrothal, that's going to require a get, right? A betrothal is like marriage in that it requires a bill of divorce to end the betrothal. So he can end the betrothal by giving a get. Because the girl is a minor, this man would give the get to her father, and she can't object to that. The divorce will happen whether she likes it or not. And that's just one of the laws of betrothal of a minor girl. So we see that it is possible to give the get against her will. Now, the Mishnah taught that a bill of divorce may be written, and now they're changing the subject back to another example of what we can write a get on or not. We haven't really got into, really what we're talking about here is what it can be written on, and you could write the get on the hand of a slave. Having brought up that subject, they went on to discuss, well, what if you placed the get in the hand of a slave and then gave her the slave? But in terms of receiving the get by placing it in her courtyard, that's going to be covered later in the tractate. Now we're continuing the discussion of what can you write the get on. So the Mishnah taught that a bill of divorce may be written on an olive leaf, on the horn of a cow, or on the hand of a slave, provided that the husband then gives her the slave or the cow. This Mishnah number 3 in chapter 2 that we're discussing. So the Gemara asks, well, granted, with regard to the hand of a slave, it is not possible to cut it off, as it is certainly prohibited to cut off the hand of a slave, and he therefore must give her the slave. But if he wrote the bill of divorce on the horn of a cow, why does he have to give her the cow? Let him cut off the horn of the cow and give her that. Why does the Mishnah state that he must give her the cow? And the Gemara answers, the verse states, Deuteronomy 24:1, and he writes her a scroll of severance and gives it in her hand, meaning that something is valid as a bill of divorce when it is lacking only writing and giving, to the exclusion of this cow's horn, which is lacking writing, cutting, and giving. Because he would have to cut off the horn in order to give her the horn, when he wrote it, when it was part of the cow, it only becomes a valid get if he gives her the whole cow. He can't cut off the horn. And that's going to become relevant as we see that you, and especially in the next Mishnah, you cannot write a get on, a tree that is living or on a leaf that is still part of a tree. Write out the whole get and then give it to her saying, well, it's in the ground, but here, you take the plant, it's yours. That will not work because it lacks cutting, right? You could cut off the leaf, but when you wrote it, it was still attached. And because it lacks cutting, it's not a valid get, even though you cut it off after you wrote it and signed in the presence of witnesses. Now, the Mishnah taught, we're on 21b, the Mishnah taught that Rabbi Yosef HaGalili says that a bill of divorce may not be written on something living, nor on food. Now, that's a minority opinion because we saw that the Mishnah says you can write the get on the hand of a slave who's certainly living. So the Gemara asks, what is the reason for this minority opinion of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili? As it is taught in a Baraisa, it is said in the Torah with regard to a bill of divorce, and he writes her a scroll of severance. From the word scroll, I have derived only that a scroll is valid. From where do I derive that it is correct to include all objects as valid materials upon which a bill of divorce may be written? And the verse states, and he writes her. In any case, i.e., a bill of divorce can be written on any type of surface. If so, what is the meaning when the verse states scroll? Is it not limiting to a kind of scroll? So if it's not limited to a scroll, if you can write the get on any kind of material, why does the verse include the word scroll? And this teaches that just as a scroll is neither alive nor food, so too a bill of divorce may be written on any object that is neither alive nor food. This is why Rabbi Yosef HaGalili deems invalid a bill of divorce that is written on a living being. And so the Gemara asks, okay, so why do the rabbis disagree with that? Why don't they hold the same way as Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, that the thing you write the get on should not be a living being or food? Why do they allow that? Well, the rabbis, the majority, contend if the verse were written, and he shall write for her in the scroll, then it would be as you said, and it would indicate that the type of surface on which the bill of divorce may be written should be like a scroll. But the Torah instead writes scroll, not in the scroll, but he writes her a scroll. And it comes to teach that a mere account of the matters is required. In other words, sefer in this context is referring not to the surface on which the bill of divorce must be written, but rather to the essence of the bill of divorce, that it is a piece of writing. That's what the word sefer, which usually means book, sometimes means scroll, but in this case, just refers to the matter itself, what is written in it, not what it's written on. Hold on a second. Yeah, okay, so the Gemara continues. And the rabbis, what do they do with this phrase in the verse? And he writes her a scroll of severance. And the Gemara answers, for them, that phrase is required to teach the principle that the woman is divorced only via writing. He must write a get for her. A get must be written. It can be written on almost anything. It can be written with almost anything, but it has to be written. As we saw yesterday, it can even be chiseled and engraved, but it can't be the resulting letters that remain raised when he chisels away the outside. It has to be an act of writing with which he divorces her, and that's why the Torah says, and he writes her a bill of divorce, or a scroll of severance is what the Torah says, and we call that is referring to the get. All right, so she is only divorced via writing. And she is not divorced via giving money. Why would we think that? It might enter your mind to say that I should juxtapose leaving marriage, i.e. divorce, to becoming married, i.e. betrothal. And I will say that just as becoming married can be affected with giving money, so too leaving marriage can also be affected with giving money. Therefore, the Torah teaches us, and he writes her, meaning that divorce can be effected only with a written get. And the Gemara asks, and the other Tana, right, who disagrees with the majority, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, from where does he derive this reasoning? He derives it from the phrase scroll of severance, which teaches that a scroll, i.e. a written document, severs her from her husband, and nothing else severs her from him. And the Gemara asks, and those who hold the other opinion, the majority, how do they explain this phrase? For them, the phrase scroll of severance is required to teach that a bill of divorce must be a matter that severs all connection between him and her. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if a man says to his wife, this is your get, on the condition that you will not ever drink wine. Okay, if you promise to never have another sip of wine, I'll give you your get. That is not a valid divorce, because once they're divorced, he has no control over her. He has nothing to say at all about what she does or doesn't do in the future. So you can give a conditional divorce. This is your get on condition that you don't drink wine for 30 days. She doesn't have a drink for 30 days, they're divorced. But he can't say this is your get on condition that you never drink wine again. That is not a valid divorce. As the Brisa says, if a man says to his wife, this is your bill of divorce on the condition that you will not ever drink wine again, or on condition that you will never go to your father's house again, that is not severance, and the bill of divorce is not valid. If a bill of divorce imposes a condition upon the woman that permanently binds her to her husband, her relationship with her husband has not been completely severed, which is a prerequisite for divorce. If, however, he imposes a condition until 30 days have passed, or for any other limited period of time, that is severance. And the bill of divorce is valid as the relationship will be completely terminated at the end of that definite period. And the Gemara asks, and the other Tana, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, from where does he derive that a stipulation without a termination point invalidates the divorce? From the fact that instead of using the term charis, the verse uses the more expanded term kerisos, inasmuch as both terms denote severance. Using the longer term teaches us two things. Divorce can be effected only via writing and not through money. And divorce requires total severance. And so the other party, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, what do they derive from this expanded term? And the Gemara answers, they do not derive anything from it. Charis and kerisos are basically the same thing. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3. Here's Mishnah number 4 in chapter 2. One may not write a bill of divorce on anything that is attached to the ground. If one wrote it on something that was attached to the ground, and afterward he detached it, and then he signed the get and gave it to her, then it is valid, right? So he can write most of the get, even on a leaf that's still attached to a tree. But if he signs it while it's still attached to the tree, not a valid get, not a divorce. But if he wrote most of the language on the get, and then he detached the leaf, and then he signed it in the presence of witnesses, and then he gave it to her, then this is a divorce. Rabbi Yehuda deems a bill of divorce invalid unless both its writing and its signing were performed when it was already detached. But that's the minority opinion. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says one may not write a bill of divorce on erased paper or an unfinished on unfinished leather, because writing on these surfaces can be forged, and the rabbis deem valid a bill of divorce that was written on either of these items. That's Mishnah number 4. The Gemara. The Mishnah taught if one wrote it on something that was attached to the ground, and he detached it before he gave it to her, then it is valid. So the Gemara challenges this. But didn't you say in the first clause of the Mishnah that one may not write a bill of divorce on something that is attached to the ground? Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the Mishnah's statement that if something was detached and signed, then it is a valid bill of divorce, is applicable only when one left a place for the essential part of the document, which is the signature. He did not write the entire bill of divorce while it was attached to the ground, and then he signed it again afterward. No. He might have written some of it while it was attached to this tree, but he left the space for the important part, his signature, empty. Then he detached the leaf. Then he signed in the presence of witnesses, and presumably they signed too, and then he hands it to the wife. That's what would make it valid. This is attached to the ground. Rather, he wrote only the standard part of the bill of divorce. However, he left a place for the essential part of the bill of divorce, which includes the name of the man and the woman, and wrote that part only after the leaf was detached. So not only his signature has to be written on the leaf after it was detached, but also the name of the husband and the wife, which makes it particular for her. If he wrote any of that stuff while it was still attached to the tree, this is not a valid divorce. And so Rabbi Elazar says that Rabbi Shaya says, and this is a case where he left a place for the essential part of the document, and so Rabbi Bar Chana says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, and this is when he left a place for the essential part of the document. And all these sages hold that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who says witnesses of the transmission of the bill of divorce effect the divorce. It is not the signatures of the witnesses on a bill of divorce that validate it. Rather, the divorce is effected by the transmission of the document in the presence of witnesses, right? As we learned that the bill of divorce that comes from overseas, right? When does she become divorced? When it's handed to her in the presence of witnesses, and the agent of delivery says this was written in my presence and signed in my presence. But the witnesses overseas are not essential, at least according to the opinion of Rabbi Elazar. What's essential is that a get that was written for her by the husband is handed to her in the presence of witnesses. Therefore, the phrase, "and he writes" from the Torah, must be referring to the writing of the bill of divorce and not to the signing of the witnesses. And the restrictions derived from this verse will apply to the writing of the bill of divorce, so the essential part may not be written on something that is attached to the ground. And this is what the Mishna is saying. One may not write even the standard part on something that is attached to the ground ab initio, lest he write the essential part of the document in this manner as well. However, if he wrote the standard part while it was attached to the ground, and then he detached it, and then he wrote the essential part, and he gave it to her, it is valid. I'm almost done. Questions or comments? Get them in. And Reish Lakish says the Mishnah should not be understood in that way. And the Mishnah should not be understood in that way, where the phrase "and signed it" is referring to the writing of the essential part, since we learned that they signed it, which is referring to the signatures of the witnesses. And it is taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that the signatory witnesses on the bill of divorce effect the divorce, right? So Rabbi Meir disagrees with Rabbi Elazar. It's not that the essential component of giving a get is that she receives it in the presence of witnesses. That has to be done. But really, the crux of the matter is that the husband writes the get in the presence of witnesses and they sign the get. So that's, according to Rabbi Meir, more important than the witnesses who watch her receiving it. Rabbi Elazar disagrees. And this is what the Mishnah is saying, says the Gemara. One may not write the essential part on something that is attached to the ground due to a rabbinic decree, lest he also have the witnesses sign while it is still attached to the ground. However, even if he wrote the essential part while it was attached and then detached it and signed it, or had it signed by the witnesses, and he gave it to her, it is valid. According to Rabbi Meir, when the verse states, "and he writes her," it is referring to when he has the bill of divorce signed. Therefore, by Torah law, the limitation that it not be attached to the ground while he writes applies only to the signing, but not to the writing. The sages decreed that the essential part of the bill of divorce also not be written while it is attached to the ground, but if he violated this decree, it is still valid after the fact. Was there ever a get in the history of the Jewish people written on a leaf of a tree while it was still attached to the ground? I doubt it. But if that did happen, we would know how to argue the matter, and we would hopefully come to an answer, right? What is the halacha? Where did it end up? Where's the halacha? One may not write a bill of divorce on something that is attached to the ground. If a bill of divorce was written on something attached to the ground, even if it was then detached and the witnesses signed it afterward, it is not a valid bill of divorce. There you go. Not a valid bill of divorce. Don't write your get on something that is attached to the ground. No part of it. Go to a beis din, write it properly on paper, have it witnessed, have it delivered by witnesses. Don't be weird. Okay, that's what I've got. Let's check some comments and questions. Okay. Nina says, I've got several questions from Aoife. What if the slave holding the get was her slave, but he neglected to give her the get or even hid it from her? Is she divorced without her awareness? Oh, fabulous question. Answer must be no. Because the slave is moving around, not a bound slave. So he cannot receive it for her because he's not like her courtyard. What if the get was placed in her courtyard, but a strong wind blew it away or some creature took it before she found it? Is she divorced without her awareness? We haven't got to that part of the discussion yet, and I am anxious to know the answer because I have the same question as you. We will find out. If a man puts the get in his courtyard, then gave the courtyard to the wife, and she asked him to clear out all things in it before she accepts the courtyard, is she divorced against her will or knowledge? I don't know. I don't think that it can happen that she's divorced without her knowledge. Like all these examples, even where it's placed into her courtyard, has to be done in front of witnesses, and then the matter is publicized. So maybe she didn't want to receive the get. Now remember that under Torah law, the husband has a right to divorce the wife whether she wants to or not, and she doesn't have the same parallel right? So that is part of this patriarchal system. So he has the right to divorce her, whether she wants to receive it or not. So there's got to be some kind of a mechanism where, he can give it to her even if she doesn't want it. Kind of similar to, like you can receive a summons to appear in court, whether you want to take it into your hand or not. I think a process server just has to literally touch your body with it or whatever. I don't know what the law is under American law, but it's something like that. It has to be done in the presence of witnesses. So it's not going to end up happening without her knowledge. That's for sure. But the case you just said is very interesting. She says, I don't accept this courtyard unless you remove all your stuff from it. Then I don't know if he can legally, say, well, I'm leaving the get in there. And she's like, well, I'm not taking the courtyard. She says, if you want the courtyard, take the get too. And she says, well, then I don't take it. So it's very interesting. I don't know what's happening in that situation. If the get is written on a slave's hand, including the gift of the slave to the wife, but the slave's hand ends up burned before she took possession, is she divorced before she took possession? Sounds like the get was destroyed. And the get was destroyed before she received it. So I would think not a divorce. Another good question. Peggy, does the woman come to the marriage with money or other possessions? Is this a requirement? No, it's not a requirement. You're talking about like a dowry. Like, does she have to bring a dowry into the marriage? No. It might be that the prospective, very often in the ancient world, like the parents were making this negotiation. The kids just, went along for the ride, as it were. And so the father of the groom might negotiate with the father of the bride of what it's going to take to set up this marriage. But there's no Torah requirement that she bring property into the marriage. He can marry a penniless girl. And he will still have to provide a marriage contract while he owes her money if he divorces her, which protects the woman. Because the husband can divorce at will and she can't, that's why the ketubah exists, is to protect her. But in terms of bringing property into the marriage, it's more that they can't, that she's protected in terms of what she brings into the marriage. She can leave the marriage with it unless the parties agreed at the outset that she wouldn't. Lucy, it does not say anything about the wife having to see or in some other way perceive or even be present when the get is delivered. Right, so we've been talking about this a little. I feel like we haven't really covered that aspect of the law yet. We've got many pages to go still in this tractate. But just at this stage, I would say that because they keep bringing up this phrase, the matter is publicized. That's really the importance of doing it in the presence of witnesses. It's not going to happen that she's divorced against her will and without her knowledge, with the exception of a minor girl's betrothal, which could be ended because it's permissible to give the get to her father. And then the father might not tell her that she was ever betrothed and then unbetrothed. That's the father's business. But remember that a minor girl who is not only betrothed but married, she does not have to accept the marriage. she has a choice to leave it, right? As before she as she becomes close to becoming an adult but not quite there, she does have that choice to reject it. But I don't think that the divorce without her knowledge is a thing, right? She's gonna know. She's gonna know. And finally, Joseph, every once in a while I hear about certain commentaries besides Rashi and the Talmud. What are a few to look into? You mentioned the Gra, for example, and do they comment on certain tractates? Well, I mean, the Gra is much more recent, right? The Vilna Gaon, I think that's 1500s, right? 1600s. And what's amazing, right, about this whole, the oral tradition, right? The Talmud is basically, we think of it as the Mishnah plus the Gemara. So that includes all the Tanaim, right, the sages of the Mishnah and before. And then the Amoraim, those are the rabbis mentioned in the Gemara. And then that's when the Gemara ended, is around the year 500. But then we've got commentary added in every century since then. So we have some major players, right, like Rashi, like Rambam, Maimonides, like Ramban, who is Nachmanides, the Ran, the Rosh, the Rashba. So there's a lot. Well, the Rosh was much earlier. But the Maharal, who's much more recent. He's only about 500 years ago. So there's many people who've made commentaries. Rashi and Rabbi Steinsaltz in our century are the only two, and Rambam, right, Maimonides, who really did an entire commentary on everything. Many of the other commentators didn't necessarily do a commentary on every tractate, every chapter, but their commentaries come up very often. So, over here in the Koran, it's just like in the Art Scroll, the editors decide which, commentaries are going to be included in the footnotes and which are not. But in terms of like a standard edition printed Gemara, Vilna Shas, the printing that was done in Vilna. So you're always going to have Rashi on one side of the text and Tosafos on the other, which was the generation of Rashi's grandchildren and other commentators in that period. And then beyond those, on the outer margins, then you have all these other people who are sometimes found there. And so here, for example, in the back of the Koran, you have, some common acronyms for these for people, who are commenting, right? So the Gra, who's the Vilna Gaon I've mentioned. The Grib is Rabbi Yehuda Bracha. The Griz, Rabbi Yitzhak Zev Soloveitchik. The Chida, who's Rabbi Chaim David Azulai. I mean, and there's dozens and dozens of others whose commentaries will come up now and then. So, in terms of which ones are you going to look up, in Sefaria is basically the Koran, so most of what's included in Sefaria is what's included in the Koran printing. Or if you look into an art scroll, you'll find a kind of slightly different set of commentaries often mentioned. But in terms of like actually pursuing, commentaries in other books, sometimes you have to really worry about it. Let these editing teams, massive teams, at the cost of millions of dollars, who sort of compiled relevant commentaries for us, one team for the Koran, one team for the Art Scroll. They do a lot for us, and you can also find in Sefaria. Hopefully that's helpful. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Wednesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.